So you said you come back about a week a month, and I'm sure you try to make as many visits as you can.
Yeah.
Tell me, what are the major issues that you see facing the area at this moment?
Well, in general, the stuff that came up today, I think, comes up a lot. Just how do you help find workers for some of the companies? How are you, helping some of the issues that, especially in the more rural parts, like where I live in the western part of Dane County, a very rural part of a town of 800 people, things like broadband. We had a long conversation at the business incubator about that. Job training and finding the right employees, trying to make sure that this region isn't neglected in any way. And, I think that can often happen, when people kind of focus on the bigger cities. So we try to spend as much time out of Madison as possible because, like I said, I live about 35 minutes west of Madison myself. But it's pretty common, in most of the district, the kind of things we hear. So it's not just, even though these things come up in Sauk County, I hear them in Iowa County, I hear them in Greene County. I hear them in other parts of the 2nd Congressional District.
We're in back to school season. What do you think of the state of education in your area right now?
Yeah, that's it does come up. I mean, I think it's been a little bit trying in that some of the changes the state did in Act 10 back in 2000, was that 10? No, it was 11, I think. 2011 when that happened. Had some perhaps unintended consequences, so while it was about collective bargaining rights when they passed it, what we've seen is it's also made it so that richer districts, property value districts, can raid teachers a little easier from lower property value districts. So, for example, the superintendent of Mineral Point, the schools in Mineral Point, the former superintendent, tells me his teachers get raided by Middleton, Wisconsin, outside Madison, but then the administrator for Benton, population 800, tells me, but Mineral Point raids his teachers, right? So you're seeing this kind of effect happen a little bit, and we've got some schools that have up to a third turnover in a year. So while the federal level, we did pass the what was called No Child Left Behind, now it's the ESEA reauthorization, so at least we did that, and actually in the end we got it done in a pretty much a bipartisan way, thanks to some work that the Senate did to tweak what the House had did. Most of the complications we see are related to those changes that happen with Act 10, with the teachers being rated, the high turnover, and even the School of Education at UW-Madison is their applications to become a teacher to enroll in that school have dropped in half just since that period. So we're seeing some struggles in keeping good quality staff, and we're hoping it doesn't have a negative effect on things like test scores and student performance.
Any thoughts on Common Core?
When we did the ESEA reauthorization, Common Core really kind of becomes more of a product of the states than what we did at the federal level. I think what we did was in the every students, what do they call it? Every Student Succeeds Act. So is it ESSA? I gotta think with exactly the acronym we use, because it used to be another one with like the same 4 letters. But we made sure that a lot of the lines of funding, the various title funding that we have out there, stayed in place, so that you're making sure that schools with higher poverty rates, you're making sure that certain types of programs, literacy programs, like for example, are still happening in all districts, so that you don't have a different quality of education if you go to Mississippi versus Wisconsin. At least at what the federal standards are, they're the same, and then the states can have a lot of differences from there. So we didn't really have Common Core come up as a subject, but we did, in a bipartisan way in the end, keep most of the funding lines in place, but we did take away some of the testing requirements, because I think testing was starting to become a little bit too often, and your teachers were teaching to the test, and this helped to make it so that you don't have that problem quite as often.
What would you like to see happening? We're coming up on a major election here.
Yeah.
I've heard some discussion that Democrats may take the majority. What would you like to see happen, either if there is a majority or even if there isn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is breaking the grasp of the Tea Party. 50 people in Congress are vetoing 90% of us, so it's 10% vetoing us by They set the agenda of what can go on the floor. There's a rule called the Hastert Rule, named after Denny Hastert, the former speaker who is going to prison, and we've taken his picture off the wall, but they still live by a rule that says within the majority party they have to have 218 people support something to put it on the floor. But if 40 or 50 diehard Tea Party people, which is kind of the core of the problem that we have, say no, something can't get scheduled. So we don't pass budgets, we haven't finished the appropriations process, and it's been very difficult to get bills through. Just breaking hold of that. I spent 14 years in the legislature where we may not agree on things, on everything, but you find out what you got in common, you move those things forward, and then you've got a basis to figure out the rest. And we're just not doing that right now because of that veto power. So I would just like to get to the point that, Democrats and Republicans may occasionally fight, but you'll also move something forward. And unfortunately, that just doesn't exist in the current Congress since 2011.
Another issue that comes up a lot in Reedsburg, and I'm sure Baraboo all across Sauk County, and I'm not sure if there's really anything people in your position can do about it, but I'll ask because it is out there.
Sure.
There's a lot of concern about heroin, prescription drug abuse, and what it's doing related to that. Is there anything people like yourself can do to try and help law enforcement address that issue?
Yeah, we actually did pass a little package of bills, and I guess if I had any complaint would be just that it didn't have a lot of the funding to help provide that support to the local communities as much as I think is robust as you would really need to do it. I mean, we've seen this bit of a pattern of where when we started having the crackdown of the prescription of opiates at the medical side of the community, that people who have maybe become addicted to the pills for pain management then wind up going to trying to find pills on the street, which can be very expensive, and they found heroin could be a lot cheaper of an alternative and yet also a lot more dangerous in many ways. And it happens everywhere, rural areas, urban areas, it hits every demographic. So there's been some that we were able to do and address it. Primarily we did a lot with the VA system, the TOMA issue that we had with the overprescription of opiates. But I think it's just really getting smarter about things like pain management, and if you have a non-pain related ailment, you can't be prescribing a pain pill, which is what I think was happening too often. And then if you can start to break that and then provide some extra support to try to get product off the street, you'll be better off. So we actually did have a little bit to touch on that. And this is one area where I think Wisconsin, the state government, has done a fairly decent job. John Nygren, who is the co-chair of the Joint Committee on Finance, a Republican from the northeastern part of the state, his daughter was addicted to heroin. And I think, because of his personal experience, he was able to put some good things in place in Wisconsin. So hopefully, while it's a national problem with, some areas like New Hampshire and others that have really strong problems with this right now, hopefully in Wisconsin, thanks to some of that we just passed federally and some of the state laws they passed, we can maybe get a better grip on it. We certainly have dealt with it, I think, in a better way at the VA hospital system, the problem we have in TOMA.
While we're talking kind of about prescriptions, one thing I do want to ask about too, because I know another thing that everyone's talking about right now is the EpiPen, and there's this debate about, is there any way to have the government step in and address prices like this? I guess what would you prefer to see happen? Do you think the government should have any involvement in that? Is there anything that you think you guys can do?
So let me take a step back and then I'll address your question directly. So, one of the problems is, healthcare costs were increasing more than everything else. And when the Affordable Care Act was implemented, one of the promises is that it would help curtail health costs, which it did. They flattened out considerably that increase that we were having. The problem is there wasn't a lot around prescription drugs in there, and we're watching prescription drugs start to really escalate again. Pharma Bro, we call him Martin Shkreli, is the guy who, remember, bought the product and increased the price. But now we're seeing it on things like the EpiPen and other stuff. So there is a group of us in Congress that are kind of working on this. We have an informal working group on it that one of the things we did recently when Pfizer was talking about doing an inversion, and a tax inversion means where they buy a company overseas so that they can no longer pay U.S. taxes, but they still want to have all the benefits of a U.S. corporation. But they wanted to have this smaller Irish company buy them.
Yep.
We had a press conference that, okay, fine, if you want to become an Irish company, then here's the difference in your prescription drug costs here in the US and Ireland, give us Irish prices, right? So we're trying to find ways to, I guess some of it might be to shame them into doing the right thing because it's not technically against the law what they're doing, it's just against morals and principles what they're doing. But I do think that there could be some legislative paths to stop this because if you're going to have just a new way to have healthcare costs spiral out of control, and you're doing it because in the EpiPen case, the CEO just wanted a big boost in salary, that's wrong for many, many reasons. And, for a lot of people who, even if you have insurance, it's still making insurance more expensive. And if you don't have insurance, it's bankrupting people. And I think it is something that needs a legislative fix.
Well, and I saw that was in the news today, how it's Apple and there are several other companies. There's this tug of war over taxes between, I think it's the EU and the US, and they're claiming they pay this tax, but now this entity wants this amount of tax. So you do kind of see that happening all around the world there.
There's a lot of companies that are doing these, whether it be inversions or other tax maneuvers that are legal. Although I think it was even, I don't know if it was Fortune magazine or Forbes magazine, one of them referred to these as corporate tax evaders. So even, good players in the business community don't appreciate what some of these companies are doing because someone's going to have to pay for that. And often it becomes the middle class who are then paying higher taxes because corporations are hiding their profits. And then they wait till they get a tax holiday to bring it back to the U.S., to repatriate is the word, the funds back in. But they want to do it at a nickel on the dollar, not what the actual tax rate would be. I mean, to me, that's a bad business practice. And while not directly illegal, it certainly seems to be at least immoral. I'm a small business owner. I've been since 91. So I have to do the math, I guess, how long I've had it. Actually, I'm sorry, since 88. 88 is when I started the business. I think the vast majority of small businesses in Wisconsin, like by vast I mean 98 to 99% of businesses, pay their taxes. And it's really just this small number of them, but it's often the really big ones that try to find ways with lots of accountants and lawyers how to not pay them. And all that means is small businesses in Baraboo and Reedsburg are going to pay more so that these multinational corporations can pay less and then in the end just pay their CEO more.
Another hot topic around here that I've heard people talking about is immigration. And where do you stand on that? I know you've got Trump saying one thing and Democrats are saying another. Where do you stand on that issue?
Yeah, I thought last session there was a bipartisan plan that came out of the Senate that, while not perfect, was a pretty good compromise that provided a path for citizenship for people who are here, but also provided extra measures at the borders to make sure you didn't have illegal immigration. That was a good balance. It wasn't, what I would do if I had my magic wand, so to speak, but it certainly was, I thought, a fair approach at how to handle it. And it passed in a bipartisan way out of the Senate, but it didn't make it through the House. So, I would hope that we can look at that and find a way again to have borders that, you have a place for people who want to come in. There's a legal process, but also for the people who are here, and especially, I've talked to more than a handful of people who've come here when they were maybe a couple months old. They don't speak the language of whatever country they came from, and to say that they should be deported because they were born here and now they're 18 and they can't go to the University of Wisconsin and get financial aid because they're not a citizen just doesn't make sense. And to deport them to a place that they don't even speak the language of just doesn't make sense. So I think that you can have a better way of dealing with it. And I think what the Senate did last session in Congress, I did a fair balance approach at dealing with both legal immigration for the future and dealing with people who are here to give them a pathway to citizenship.
Now, by talking about people who you don't want to deport, you're talking about people who were brought here as infants or toddlers or small children, because obviously if they were born here, they're naturalized citizens.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a surprising number of people who have come here very, very young, who now are like 18 trying to go to the UW. That's generally where we've run into this more than anything else, and they can't get financial aid because they're technically not a citizen, but they may not even speak the language of the country that their parents came from. But also other people have been here now for years and years and years, and to think that, you know, you're just going to uproot the families and do that is not a practical solution, and I'm pretty pragmatic, and I think that, you know, making sure that there is a path to citizenship for those aspiring Americans with rights and responsibilities makes sense.
I just did a story on language barriers in EMS and police, and
Yeah.
one of the things they had mentioned to me was, in most cases where there is a language barrier, the children speak English.
Yeah.
And does that seem to be what you are noticing, especially with these younger people who may face deportation?
Yeah, I mean, that's like the classic example, right? Is someone who's like, I've been here for all these years. Wasn't it recently there was someone, I thought, a valedictorian, I thought it was in a Wisconsin school, but I could be wrong with that, who, while she gave her valedictorian speech, said, by the way, I didn't come here until I was however old, and, you know, but there clearly you would never have known that, right? And, I just think that there's a lot of reasons why having immigration reform in a logical way makes sense, because you're just not going to deport millions of people like, Donald Trump has suggested. In fact, even Donald Trump, I think he's doing it today. He's supposed to be delivering a major speech on immigration. Will probably back off of that because it was impractical and illogical, and it sounded good for primary season when you have a small number of voters, but when you have a bigger number of voters, you have to be more realistic in explaining what you're really going to do if you're going to actually become president.
As far as the president goes, have you announced at all if there's anybody in particular that you favor? Do you have any thoughts on either of the candidates?
Yeah, I support Hillary Clinton. I mean, I think in many ways Donald Trump, his approach to this race has scared me in, not just, his kind of quick, nature to go after people aggressively, to, refer to women as pigs, to refer to Mexicans as rapists. I mean, you just go down the list, his insults have just come out way too freely for someone who wants to be the leader of the free world. And I also worry about some of the rhetoric about banning Muslims and other things, what that does to us internationally. I mean, I just recently was in the Middle East, and I can tell you from conversations I had with people very directly, I mean, if Donald Trump got elected, I think that would cause even more problems. It gives ISIS even more reasons to be able to say, look, see, I told you this is what the United States stands for, and I think that's a dangerous prescription. And then conversely, I would argue that Hillary Clinton probably is running for president with more experience than anyone who's ever run for president, at least in my adult memory. Having been First Lady, a U.S. Senator, Secretary of State, that's an enormous amount of experience going in. And I think that that's probably why, while she may not be as exciting as Donald Trump when he gives a speech, she certainly has a lot more facts and knowledge about what the job entails.
Going back more locally here,
Yeah.
just from the area that you serve, is there anything in particular that you think we should be proud of as a region, as a state, too?
Well, I think a lot of things. I mean, one of the things that definitely stands out is, Upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. I mean, we are fundamentally nice people. We're kind. We don't have the, arrogance and bravado, I think, that you might see in some other parts of the country. And, we might be passive aggressive every now and then, but, we're decent people, and I'm really proud of that. I mean, there's nowhere else I'd rather be from than here, because that's about quality of life and everything else. And I think in general, we've, again, across party lines, for the most part, until maybe the last couple of years, have been very respectful of each other at a different level, and we valued some of the public services that we provided at a different level, like our university system and the K-12 schools. I think there's been a little bit of a decline on that, but in general, I think we're still ahead of most states. And, I'm proud. That's why I love to be from here and to live here, because, I think we're good neighbors, and I think that's a higher compliment than a lot of compliments I could think of.
Sure. Talking about respecting and supporting local schools, local services, I know one service around here that gets a lot of support from the public is obviously law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what's been in the news recently. Do you have any thoughts on, say, like the Black Lives Matter, about supporting your local precincts
Yeah, I think a lot of it again comes to the rhetoric, especially during campaign season. When people have that elevated rhetoric, it is licensed for other people to have elevated rhetoric. And I don't care where the elevated rhetoric comes from. I don't think that's a good thing. It's again very anti-Wisconsin, right? How we deal with things back home, and I think that's been a big part of the problem. I think when you start saying the things that some people have said about different people and who should be able to come into the country and all the rest, you're setting a bar that shouldn't come from your leaders, so to speak. And I think that's been a big part of the problem that we've seen. I think a little bit of it is, and I did vote against a provision to supply military equipment to some of the local police, because I think some of that equipment isn't necessary in Baraboo, Wisconsin, or Madison, Wisconsin. And I think some of that's been used maybe a little more aggressively than it needs to in some situations. And I think that's something that, again, a small part of it, but something does really directly to Congress that I thought didn't make sense to put some of that out there. Having said that, I do think you have to provide adequate funding and support for law enforcement for what they do best, which is our community policing and those kind of tools. So let's focus on what we should do in the communities and maybe not look at some of the extraneous items.
I saw that you have worked on a plan to help students who are deep in debt, graduates who are deep in debt. Can you tell me more about that? I mean, we're in the back to college season. Are we making any progress as a state to try and help people who are struggling to pay off their debt?
Sure. So I could go really long on this, and I won't. But so I'm on the Education Workforce Committee. We deal with K-12, pre-K, and higher education on the committee. So I have done a lot, especially around financial aid. So a couple bills that I was a part of leading passed. One around FAFSA, the application for financial aid, so you can use your prior year rather than waiting too late, so when you're applying to a college how much financial aid you have. And also saving the Perkins program last year, although it was only a 2-year extension, it's still financial aid. I wouldn't have been able to go to school if I didn't have financial aid, and I don't think that should be the barrier. If you're smart enough and capable enough, it shouldn't be just because you can't afford to, right? That's something we need to, as a bigger community, help provide for. So I've done some of those things and actually passed them through Congress, but the two areas that I still think we need work on, one is refinancing of student loans for people who currently have higher interest loans. Some people have like 6% or 6.6 or 8% loans, and clearly the interest rates are way lower. And if you allowed a better way to allow the refinancing, you'd put more money into the pockets of people then who could buy a car or buy a house. Really we should be profiting off of that anyway. The second thing is let's deal with that before you even get to there. Student debt has quadrupled in the last 11 years. How do you try to approach something that so that people aren't leaving with the big debt, like the University of Wisconsin? Now I think you leave with somewhere like 28,000. So there's a proposal that we've introduced that actually is very similar to something Hillary Clinton's put out there, which is a debt-free college proposal, that by doing things like work study, and if a state continues to keep their maintenance of effort to their university system, there's a way to make they can kind of doing work study jobs and go through college and leave with no debt at all. To me, that's a real win-win, and it doesn't have a huge price tag, but I think we as a community, broader community, benefit from doing that. So I think you got to deal with it up front. How do you not have the costs get as high as they've gotten, and then how do you address that debt for those who already have that burden?
And earlier in our discussion, you had talked about how difficult it is for employers to find skilled workers. Yeah. Is there any way they could play a part in this? For example, I've heard of some companies who will send you to school because they are that desperate. Now you have to sign an agreement saying you'll stay with them for how many years.
But you're seeing that. And you're seeing companies like Teal Plastics that are helping put equipment into the high schools, extrusion equipment, so people can learn that. If they like doing that, that might be a path they want to go to when they graduate. So you're starting to see those partnerships happen more and more, and I think that's fantastic. I was just down in Beloit, and Fairbanks Morse is doing that within the high schools there, because they just grew from 200 people to 500 people since 2012. And they need a lot of workers. So I think you're seeing a lot of those partnerships happen, and I think as important as for some people who want to go to college, I think it's equally important that people who don't want to go to college but want to have a skilled, good family supporting wage have access to get those skills. And I also have a bill I've introduced to really expand apprenticeship programs. where you can go and work for someone and learn the job. And while you're learning it, you're getting paid, but then ultimately you're going to have the skills and be able to make a really strong family supporting wage. Compared to Germany, we use it about 1/10 per capita than they do. And I think there's a lot of room. It's not just in your traditional welding and things. I think it's in healthcare. I think it's in a lot of other areas. And if you have that, people can get on the job training and be able to earn a living and support their family right off the bat.